if you need to factor an expression that has more than 3 terms, so this one right here has 4 terms, then you can try the factor by grouping method. And this is when you put your terms into groups and find a common factor within those groups. So here we have 4 terms here. There's not a common factor between all 4 terms, so we're going to group some of our terms together and see if we can find a common factor in those groups. So in our first 2 terms, there's a y that's common in both terms. So let's try to pull out that y in those first 2 terms. And we're going to get y on the outside of brackets and on the inside x minus 5. So y times x is xy, and then y times negative 5 is negative 5y. Now let's actually group our last 2 terms and see what happens. So when we group those last 2 terms, our greatest common factor between those last 2 terms is going to be a negative 2. Let's try to pull that out. And in the brackets, we're going to get x, and then negative 2 times a negative 5 will give us this positive 10. So again, negative 2 times x is just this negative 2x, and negative 2 times negative 5 is a positive 10. So notice how in the brackets here we have something that's in common. We have an x minus 5 in common in these brackets. So we can actually factor out this x minus 5 since x minus 5 is being multiplied by y and x minus 5 is being multiplied by negative 2. So x minus 5, that binomial, is our common factor there, so I can pull that out. And then we're left with y minus 2. So we can write that as a binomial, y minus 2. So x minus 5 times y minus 2 is the factored form of this expression at the top. So when you're factoring by grouping, you always want to try to group it strategically, so when you pick out a common factor from your groups, you get something that's in common in the brackets. So that's what you want to try to get. So let's try another one. So we have another expression with 4 terms, and we can't find a common factor between all 4 terms, so we're going to group this. Now let's just start off with grouping our first 2 terms, because there is an a in both of the first 2 terms. So if we pull out that a, we'll be left with b plus 1 in brackets. A times b is just this ab, and a times 1 is just a positive a. Now let's just group our last 2 terms. So a common factor between negative 2 minus 2b, well, let's pull out that negative 2 to get rid of the negative. So in the brackets, we're going to be left with 1 plus b. Negative 2 times 1 is negative 2. Negative 2 times b is negative 2b. So let's look at what we have in the brackets. In the first bracket, we have b plus 1. In our second, we have 1 plus b. Are those the same? Well, they actually are the same. B plus 1 is the same thing as 1 plus b, so I'm just going to rewrite that. I'll rewrite it as b plus 1. So I didn't change the equation at all. I just rearranged this 1 plus b into b plus 1 because these are the same thing. So now we have something that's exactly common, b plus 1, and we can pull that out. We can factor out that whole binomial b plus 1. And we're just left with a and minus 2. So that's going to be our second binomial. So our expression factored is b plus 1 times a minus 2. So here's our next question, and we need to factor this. So we're going to try factor by grouping because we have 4 terms. So if we group the first 2 terms together, x squared plus 3y, there's no common factor that we can pull out, so we might have to rearrange this. X squared can probably be grouped with this minus 3x because there's an x in both terms. So if we rearrange this, I'm going to put that minus 3x right after x squared, and then we're going to put plus 3y minus xy. So from our first two terms, we can factor out an x, and in the brackets we're going to be left with x minus 3. And then in our last two terms, there's a y that's common, so let's actually factor out a y. I'm going to factor out a positive y, but then we're left with 3 minus x in brackets. Now, in both our brackets, we have x minus 3 and 3 minus x. Are those the same? They're not. Even when we rearrange the second brackets to put x first, we would get negative x plus 3. And that's still not the same as x minus 3. But what if instead of a positive y, I pulled out a negative y? Because that'll change something here. If I pull out a negative y, this 3 will become negative, and our x will become positive. So let's just check if that actually makes sense. Negative y times negative 3, that is a positive 3y, and negative y times positive x, well, that is a negative xy. So we factored out a negative y correctly, but x minus 3, is that the same thing as negative 3 plus x? Yes, it is, and I'm just going to rearrange this and rewrite it. So I'm keeping the beginning the same, x times x minus 3, factored out a minus y, and in the brackets I'm going to write x first, so it becomes x minus 3 in our second brackets. And that is exactly the same. X minus 3 is the same in each bracket. So we could factor out that x minus 3. And we're just left with this x and this minus y, so that's our second binomial, x minus y. So x minus 3 times x minus y is the factored form of this expression at the top.